3 o'clock, so I think we will get started. So welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you are able to join us for today's Mineta Transportation Institute Research Snaps webinar. My name is Hillary Nixon and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director for MTI. MTI is a U.S. Department of Transportation funded university transportation center at San Jose State University. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. During today's webinar, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can submit them through the conference Q&A or chat feature. We are recording this webinar and the link to view it will be available shortly after the webinar on our website and social media pages. We've all experienced the frustration of being stuck in traffic. Peak period traffic volume congests roads all over the world. Today's webinar focuses on recently completed research that explores how payments to passengers could serve as a congestion management solution. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Paul Mineta. Paul is an MTI research associate with more than 15 years of experience conducting research into approaches to increase carpooling to reduce traffic. Paul's co-authors on this project include John Niles, Richard Lee, and Brittany Bogue. Paul, I will turn it over for you now.
Well, thank you, Hillary, and welcome everybody. I'm speaking to you from Auckland, New Zealand, so if you're confused by the backdrop of my traffic, it is because it's down under. Thanks again, and John Niles is on the call also today, a co-author. Richard Lee unfortunately couldn't join us, but John is there to support me and answer questions or help answering questions at the end. So as Hillary mentioned, this is the idea behind this project is to have a payment system that rewards people for traveling as passengers at a level that clears congestion. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the presentation and then dig into each different part of it. That way we don't, that way hopefully we don't run out of time. Initially talk about the big idea, the radical idea behind this, to talk about then the methodology that we developed for evaluation, the case study route that we looked at, what the current traffic is on that case study route, the survey, and several of the slides are results from the survey that we did, the impact of introducing congestion clearing payments to passengers in our modeling, and how the traffic stacks up, and the fact that the queue does eventually rebuild, and what we decided to do about that, and finally a benefit cost analysis that shows that this, whilst it costs would cost $140 million over 20 years in 2019 dollars, the benefits would be $500 million, and the benefit cost ratio 4.5 to 1. So I'm going to get started into the detail of the presentation now. So the idea is rewarding passengers, rewarding people for traveling as a passenger. And critical to the ability to do this is that there's an app that helps us know where that people are traveling as passengers, where you want them to, in the direction you want them to, at the time you want them to. And we had to satisfy ourselves that such apps exist. In this case, on the slide you see, this is a screenshot from a provider of such an app, a verification app. There are several available, and I've added to this by showing the bottleneck location line, the passenger in the bus going over that line, and money going into that person's account with a little ka-ching sound, so that we really get the idea that what we're doing is paying people to travel as passengers over 20 years. So it's not a short-term emergency solution, and expecting to remove congestion at a rising price over time, knowing that as demand rises, prices will rise as well. So the approach to the project was, it's a standard approach: literature review and thinking and focus groups and a survey. And we developed a methodology, and this methodology really doesn't exist to compare a build nothing, pay passengers solution to an expand the road solution that that may be there, or a do nothing solution that often is held up as a, well, we got to do something because the result of do nothing is so bad. So the 6 steps that we identified was firstly understanding the current traffic, understanding the nature of the people on the route. And this is critical, is understanding, will people travel as passengers? Are they the sort of people who would travel as passengers? Understanding the growth trends for the coming period of time, the 20 years, having some idea about what that's going to look like, estimating the benefits of removing the congestion for that whole period of time. And that takes a bit of getting your mind around, understanding the costs of doing that, and then calculating the benefit cost ratio, which I've already quickly shown you. In order to think carefully through this, we needed a case study route, and we chose a route in California. It's from Half Moon Bay to Silicon Valley, and Half Moon Bay is kind of like a bedroom community for people working in Silicon Valley. There's a bottleneck leaving town with a capacity of about 1,400 vehicles an hour. So you can see on this map, you can see the red backed up during the morning peak. And it backs up sometimes all the way onto Highway 1, which is the one running vertically there, and also onto Main Street. And I don't know if Hillary, you could just feed me back. Can you see my mouse moving on the screen? Yep, good. So people can see what I'm pointing at. That's excellent. So here is the bottleneck. It's a single lane going out along the San Mateo Road. And on average, about 1,400 vehicles an hour, 23 vehicles a minute leave that point. And what we see is this analysis that came from our survey rather than from on the ground statistics. There isn't the technology in place to track information like this at a bottleneck. What you're seeing here is the blue is the 23 vehicles an hour that are capacity. The orange pillars are the excess volume of traffic arriving each minute. Against the right-hand scale, you've got the gray line, which is showing the extent of the traffic congestion at that point of view, the length of the queue. So you see the queue rises as excess traffic arrives. The queue falls as there's less traffic arriving, and so constantly. So in this case, you're seeing a queue up above 200 vehicles during about 8:30 in the morning. You're seeing that there's 220 hours of vehicle delay each day between 7 and 9 a.m. and fully 2,800 vehicles are delayed during that time. The green line is a very boring line. That's the average number of people departing the queue, and that's basically also against the right-hand scale. And what that's showing is that it's they're all single occupant vehicles, by the way. And so the number of vehicles leaving equals the number of people leaving. So very important to our project was the survey. And I just want to go quickly through the survey questions at a high level so you understand what sorts of things we were asking. So where people live, if they travel in the congestion or not, what their mode of travel is, what their departure time is, and what the impact of the congestion is on them. If the congestion went away, would any of those things change? Would they start to travel on this route? Would they change their departure time? Would they change their mode? While we're waiting for congestion to go away, would they help by traveling as a passenger some of the time? And so here we're saying, are you the sort of person who would travel as a passenger? And this is really interesting. Some people say, no, I'm not. I'm not the sort of person who would travel as a passenger. So then you say, would you do it for money? And then they say, oh, well, yeah, okay, if there was money involved, I might travel as a passenger. If then yes, and how much money if it was easy to do? And we asked them how much on a bus, how much in a van pool, how much in a carpool, and how much in an Uber shared, Uber pool style of service. And if on the other hand, they're not a passenger person, even for money, and there's still some people like that, then we say, well, would you give people a ride? If they said no, well, would you give people a ride for money? And if they said yes, they'd give people a ride for money, then obviously how much money. And the results of this survey allowed us to generate a bunch of different sorts of information, valuable information. And I'll just quickly run through the sort of information we got. If congestion went away, 88% of people who are currently traveling would switch to a different time of travel. So 88% of the people are traveling at least at less preferred time than they would like to due to the congestion. And this, I think the magnitude of that surprised me. would you share a ride if the deal was right? And what we find is that at half the people would travel as a passenger if the deal was right. Further, roughly a quarter of them would give rides to those people who would travel as a passenger. So note that if only half the people travel as a passenger, which is a high quantity, it says that the maximum reduction in the traffic we could achieve in total would be 50%. But, and by the way, for the quarter of the people would continue to travel as drive alone people. And so what is this deal? How much would the deal need to be? Now, you saw in the advertising for the event, $15 a day. To begin with, you'd get some change quite early on at a much, for no money. If it was easy to travel as a passenger, some proportion of people would travel as a passenger. But basically what this chart shows is that if you want to get, for example, up to 40% of people, you're probably going to spend $10 a day on incentives. And if you want to get up to almost half the people, you're going to spend $15. And so that's what that represents. We also asked for people providing rides, and we see that we get up to about 25% of people providing rides at about $15. So this is really just getting an idea and able to then work out what it'll cost. So then we applied the thinking. Now looking back at that initial graph, one of the things I forgot to mention is that there were 512 vehicles in the orange bars at the top. So you could say in that initial graph that if we got rid of 512 people to switch, we would get rid of congestion. But what happens is what we call an intra-peak demand shift. What goes from the peak at the moment being running really from the whole period of 7 through 9 a.m. We get rid of the peak through 7 o'clock, but what happens is over the course of time, as a result of congestion not being there, people travel closer and closer to their preferred time. And what happens then, even with all the people traveling as passengers who possibly could, we find that we get the queue reforms. And so you see that queue happening from 8 o'clock onwards. So that's with everybody switched to be a passenger who possibly could. And so we put our heads together. Well, what are we going to do about that? And the conclusion we came to was that we would have to pay a going early bonus. We would reward people for traveling earlier than the planned time. And so we then modeled that out over 20 years and say, how is the traffic going to grow? And the very bottom line here from 5 to 9 a.m., what you see is these numbers starting at 2157, that's the number of people in the first year, through to year 20, 3,990 people, so roughly double over 20 years would be the number of people we would have to reward for traveling as passengers. But look what happens at the very beginning in the first year, there's only in that 8 o'clock time period, only 14 people are traveling as passengers. That's because all the rest of them, we've cleared the traffic out of the way for the people who are single occupant vehicle drivers. And that extends out to the point that eventually it gets to we're spending as an unintended consequence. We're rewarding people to be passengers and creating a room for single occupant vehicles to travel. So we had to then say, well, what will we do about that? And we came to the conclusion that we would eventually need to do something that restricted single occupant vehicle travel so that people could be traveling as passengers during those preferred times. So here's the benefit cost analysis, and just really quickly, in declining in benefit, $176 million in 2019 dollars discounted at 3% is the value of the incentive being distributed into the community. So if you think about other ways of solving traffic congestion, this is a distributive process that puts money into the community, and we know that that flows through the community and expands the economy of the community. I'll only mention a couple. We also found that quite a few people would start traveling who aren't currently traveling, and they'd be looking for jobs. And so we think that we get a lot of benefit for the local economy from the fact that more people would be getting out and getting jobs and having benefits from or other type of activity. And then the third item I'll mention at $111 million, reduced inconvenience cost. This is sleeping later in the morning before you have to leave early to avoid the congestion. And then you get the fourth item, reduce vehicle operating costs and emissions. And emissions is interesting. Over 20 years, this process would reduce 181,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions. And it has a co-benefit. So rather than this being a strategy that would cost money to reduce carbon emissions, you get a benefit of almost $2,800 a ton of gain from implementing this if it was a climate change strategy. And this is for costs of $71 million for the passenger incentives and $29 million for the Go Early incentives. I will mention that the Go Early incentives still need to be more deeply investigated because we figured them out after we'd completed our survey. So the next time we do the survey, we would go back and we'd actually find out whether our assumptions on Go Early were sufficient. So the next steps for the process for our concept is to look for new locations to further test the methodology. We'd really love to run this where we were comparing to a real plan to expand a route. And so you've got to expand the route option, you've got a do nothing option, and you've got this build nothing but pay passengers option in the evaluation process. And we're also interested in finding funding for a pilot project on the case study route. It would be great to go back there, redo the work, and update it, and then actually put it, work out how to put it in place in reality with a plan of doing that. So thanks to the Mineta Transportation Institute for supporting this piece of work. And also, I think it was funded by the US Department of Transport. So thanks also to them. Thank you, Hillary, for your support through the project and for the interest in the site. And now I'm totally happy to answer questions. I'll flick back to this slide, and any questions that come in, I'm happy to dig into.
Perfect. So there were a couple of questions that were submitted in advance, and I know that we're starting to get some questions coming in through the chat or the Q&A. So folks, feel free to submit your questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. But I think probably the big picture question is, where does the money come from for this solution? You're talking about a lot of money. Who's paying this money for the congestion clearing passengers? Where does it come from?
Sure, thanks, Hillary. Well, there's two answers that need to be addressed. One is the short term, when we go through the process of finding out if the spreadsheeting and assumptions we made hold up. And so research funding should be a source of money for pilot projects. That's where that would come from, the normal research funding sources, CMAQ funds perhaps, or there's a variety of different places that could come from. And then there's longer term, and we're looking at how do you cement this in place so that you can fund it for 20 years, $140 million over 20 years? Well, one way I think would be to say, well, how would we fund it if we expanded the road? Because actually in our calculations, it's a similar number. Of course, it's easier to fund something when you're building something than it is to avoid building it. Otherwise, in the long term, we see property values on the route are pretty likely to rise. And so it could be funded out of property taxes. It could be funded, for example, you could combine this with a strategy of parking charges and fund it out of parking charges from the destination. It could be mixed with congestion pricing. In fact, the amounts of money involved would probably be much lower if on the same route you were to introduce congestion pricing and gathering money from people who travel maybe from all the vehicles that travel and using those funds to reward the people who are traveling as passengers. The main thing is that either congestion pricing moves in the same way as rewards. In other words, you avoid paying the congestion charge and you receive the reward. So they're additive to getting you the change that you're looking for.
Great. So there's a couple of questions that have come in that I think are on a related topic. So I'll try and put them together. But it relates to this idea of kind of the destination. Like, do the passengers and drivers, are they going to the same destination? Kind of what would be maybe the catchment area, and how do you guarantee that return trip home? Like, is it planned out that way? And how would that part of the process work? Because it's one thing to get to where you want to go. It's a whole other thing to want to make sure to get home. And then once I've made it into the Bay Area, then how do you spread out from there?
Yeah. So in the case of this particular, one of the reasons this was an interesting place to do our initial work is that everybody in the catchment that goes, if you live around Half Moon Bay and you're going to Silicon Valley, you have to, this is the only funnel you've got to go through. And so we had people from around the catchment, a number of different small communities around Half Moon Bay. And they were going to as many as 30 different destination locations in the wider area. And we modeled that, but this is one of the reasons you have to do a pilot. We modeled it to the extent we could, but with so many different variables, what we were really looking at is saying, well, are there destinations where there's, say, 100 people traveling there each day? Because if there's 100 people traveling there each day, it's probable that through the morning period, as people arrived somewhere to meet up and go to their destination, there would be enough to form carpools to go. And we were working on the idea of carpools, although in the long run, there's no reason that this couldn't be bus routes as well, reliable bus routes. The return journey, though, is a challenge in all cases. And in the casual carpooling in the Bay Area that happens, people go back to there's a meeting place to get a ride home. And there are meeting places, various different meeting places. And we imagine that that's how this would play out. Dynamic ride sharing tools, carpooling apps are possible. Definitely a way of forming those return journeys. We don't know to what extent these rides would be people doing things on the fly versus making ongoing arrangements. The traditional carpool has been ongoing arrangements. The question is, when the reward is there, at a significant level, and if you like, on average, we were taking a $15 benefit for switching to be a passenger, and we had an average $6 go early reward. So on average, we'd be paying about $21. Now, for $21 a day, how much effort are people going to be prepared to put into making that work? Realizing that if you get it set up, it doesn't take too much effort to keep it working, and you keep getting that benefit. So we think that, you know, it may be a mixture of totally dynamic on the fly carpooling, and it might be quite a bit of people making permanent arrangements. And the main thing is that everybody goes through that funnel, and we see part of our idea is a meeting place carpool or a car park location that you would put near the bottleneck that would help people to form fuller cars there.
So, and I think you touched on this a little bit when you were looking at kind of how many people you thought would accept, you know, that 45% of people would switch at the $15 payment. But does that give you enough to reach that congestion clearing level that you need to have for that route? Was that kind of how you targeted that amount, was to get to that congestion clearing level?
Yes. Well, we wanted to find out how many people would change, and you know, it was certainly possible that it wouldn't be enough, right? So we went into this project not knowing what that answer would be, and we asked people, how much would it take for you to start traveling as a passenger? And realizing that you're going to have to reward everybody at that, whatever that highest number is, to get the level that you need to get. Now, what's really interesting is the little bit of work that we've done looking at how this would fit with congestion pricing. Because in fact, you don't need to reduce, if you're going to get some reduction from the congestion pricing, then the amount you need to change is actually a lower percentage, and you'd be focusing on a lower than the full $15 amount. But in our work, we weren't trying to convince people to travel as a passenger. We were just saying, you know, if you did, we know it would take some effort. How much do you think it would take to get you to move? And then we stacked it up, and we found out that it came out to the 45 to 50. we rounded that. We said, well, that's pretty close to half.
So there's been a comment that a question submitted related to stated preference versus actual behaviors. And did you look at kind of when you put in your estimates, kind of being conservative? Because there's one thing what people state they will do, yes, $15, you've convinced me I'm going, and then what they will actually do in reality. And did you look into some sensitivity analysis with your work?
We did not do, I think there's a specific approach to surveying and doing stated preference and understanding that, and we didn't do any depth in that methodology. We have taken people's answers at face value. We also harbor some expectations that it might be less costly than we think, because at the moment this is set up with people's perception of how difficult it will be to carpool and how difficult it would be, but if you think some of those difficulties are because my friends don't carpool, I'm going to look funny if I'm carpooling. But if we've created a thick market for carpooling and it's become easy as a result, and we've really got it set up so that it's firing and half the people are doing it, it's much less likely that people are going to set such a high hurdle. So we think on the one hand that it could arguably be more expensive, and by the way, it could arguably be less expensive on a day-by-day basis.
So there was a question submitted. I think it's kind of an interesting concept, and whether or not you thought about with this model you've put together, what the commenter describes as a loss aversion option, where you would be prepaid an amount, but then they lose that funding or deduct that funding if they don't carpool. So maybe not a post payment, but a prepayment. So they don't want to lose out on it.
Haven't thought that one through, to be honest.
Okay.
I would say that our current approach to getting people to switch is focused on achieving that switch. And what we find is people say, well, yeah, but when we stopped offering the benefit, everybody just went back to doing what they were doing. So they didn't really change their behavior. I would observe that their behavior is maximizing what they get for themselves. And they do things consistent with that always. And so we don't say we are going to pay people to switch, which requires us to know what they were doing and now what they are doing. We're saying reward them for doing what we want them to do. So if they're traveling as a passenger, they get the reward. If they're traveling as a passenger, according to whatever the local rules are of time and direction and so on.
In your the cost benefit analysis, you specifically looked at a benefit related to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So fewer individual cars on the road, you have reduced greenhouse gas emissions. I'm wondering how you came up with some of those numbers. There's a question about, if you're driving people around because we have to take them to multiple destinations or something, you've got a car full of people and they're going to multiple destinations, what that might mean. But I guess if you could run a little bit on the behind the scenes of that greenhouse gas emissions estimate.
So we had an estimate of what the traffic would look like and how it would operate over the 20-year period if we don't do anything, if this isn't implemented. And then we've said, what does the picture look like if we do implement it? And so you've got a large amount of reduced delay. You haven't got traffic at Half Moon Base sitting waiting to get past the bottleneck. And then over time, you've got trips not taken. And the biggest piece there is the vehicles that don't leave home each day. And so we've estimated how much fuel and therefore emissions would be involved in all the vehicles that didn't leave home and drive to a destination and then drive back.
Okay. So I think we've talked a lot, or at least I think a lot of the underlying assumptions initially is based on this is a carpooling model. When you did your cost benefit analysis, did you look at it versus kind of a carpool model versus a larger, like a transit model where you can put a whole lot more people into a single vehicle and reduce greenhouse gas emissions or change the benefit cost ratio that way?
Okay, we didn't analyze it against the alternatives, we asked people how much they would want to travel as a passenger in a carpool, a bus, a van pool. And we know that van pools are probably the most energy efficient, especially emissions efficient mode of travel. But what we found was that when we drew 3 lines actually on that initial that graph that shows, I can quickly show you this graph here. We drew 3 lines. One line was carpool, another was bus, another was van pool, and the lowest cost solution was carpools. And so that's the one that we've talked about mostly and gone forward and modeled. But we are agnostic to how people travel as a passenger. What is really most important? Traffic congestion is caused by there being too many drivers for the amount of road. If we can reduce too many concurrent drivers, if we can reduce the concurrent driver count, then we reduce traffic congestion. And the best way is for those drivers to start being passengers.
Great. Well, we hit really quickly. We hit our 3:30 mark. In fact, 3:31 here, local Pacific. So I'm going to wrap up the webinar now. I know that there are some additional questions that we didn't get to. And I do apologize for folks, because obviously this is a really interesting topic and there's a lot of interest in it. So I would definitely ask those who didn't get your questions answered to please take a look at the report itself, which is available on our MTI website. And I know that the authors, Paul, John, and their colleagues would be more than happy to respond specifically to questions. So feel free to reach out to them. And I want to thank everyone for what was a really interesting and enlightening discussion. So Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And the slide that's up right now, my email address is at the bottom of that slide. If anybody would like to send an email, I'd be really happy to respond.